Imagine a breathtakingly beautiful woman, admired by all, married to a perfect man. But behind this dream, marriage lies a consuming ambition, an insatiable thirst that will lead her to unsuspected depths. Amaka, 23, seemed to have everything she needed to be happy. Married to Chidimma, a successful young entrepreneur, she lived in abundance, showered with gifts and luxuries that were the envy of all the women in her residential neighborhood. But what no one saw was the deep emptiness growing inside her, an emptiness that neither jewels nor cars could fill. How far will Amaka go to satisfy her insatiable appetite for power and wealth? And what price will she pay for daring to defy the limits of what's possible? When gifts are no longer enough, she turns to occult forces, and that's when everything changes. Between betrayals, bewitchments, and unthinkable sacrifices, Amaka is about to discover that greed and bad choices always have a price. And that price is often much higher than she imagined. If you want to know how far this path will take her, stay with us until the end of this story full of suspense and twists. At Africanstories, we take you on a journey through fascinating tales of African wisdom, stories that will captivate you and make you think. Never miss our stories again. Subscribe to the Africanstories channel now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Together, let's dive into the mysterious world of Amaka and many other captivating stories that will transport you to the heart of African traditions. Amaka was known throughout the neighborhood for her beauty. Her large, expressive eyes could captivate anyone, and her smile lit up the room every time she entered. At just 23, she had won the heart of Chidimma, a successful yam entrepreneur. Their story seemed like something out of a fairy tale. An accomplished, upright man in love, ready to do anything to please his wife. But behind the perfect appearance of this marriage, a shadow was gradually spreading, an insatiable thirst that nothing seemed to appease. Chidimma never skimped on gifts. Amaka was constantly surrounded by sumptuous objects, sparkling gold jewelry, designer bags, bespoke dresses that she proudly displayed on their outings. But despite all this, there was still an emptiness inside her, a latent dissatisfaction that drove her to want more. The birth of their daughter Chidimma had filled their lives with happiness, but Amaka never seemed totally satisfied. She always asked for more, every gift quickly becoming obsolete in her eyes, every attention insufficient. One day, while watching a TV series, she spotted an expensive watch on the wrist of an actress. Without thinking, she immediately sent the photo to Chidimma, demanding the same watch. It wasn't long before he stopped off at a luxury boutique to buy it on his way home. Amaka, excited, greeted him with smiles and hugs. But deep inside, the desire for more continued to grow. Each new gift only fueled this insatiability. At first, Chidimma was happy to please his wife. But over time, Amaka's incessant demands began to weigh on him. One day, when she asked for a new car, he hesitated, aware that his finances were no longer as solid as before. But Amaka insisted, demanding that he give in to her whims. Chidimma's refusal was met with cold indifference. She turned her back on him in their bed, refusing any intimacy, creating an invisible distance between them. With her marriage beginning to crumble, Amaka turned to her best friend, Adana. Adana, a woman of dubious associations, whispered a dangerous idea to her. "If Chidimma can't give you what you want, maybe it's time to look elsewhere for help," she said mysteriously. She then told her about charlatans who could bend the will of any man. Desperate, Amaka allowed herself to be seduced by the idea and began to frequent these sorcerers in search of power over her husband. The first time Amaka tried a spell, she asked Chidimma to give her a villa. The next day, much to her surprise, he sold some of his possessions and bought her the house of her dreams. Amaka was ecstatic. She shared her victory with Adana, boasting about how she had tamed her husband. But this victory only strengthened her obsession. She was now convinced that nothing could stop her. As time went by, Amaka began to dream of bigger things. A simple house was no longer enough. She wanted cities, empires, monuments to her name. She returned to Chidike, this time to ask him to build her an entire city. Chidike, despite her spell, refused categorically. Finances would not allow it, and he had to think of their family's future. For the first time, the spell didn't seem to be working. Amaka was furious. How dare he refuse her proposal after all she'd done for him? With Adana's help, she decided to hit back harder. They heard of a very powerful marabout, living in a remote village, capable of subjecting any man to his wife's will. Blinded by her own desire, Amaka set off on the journey, unaware of the consequences it would have on her life and that of her family. The charlatan, an old man with piercing eyes, received her in his modest hut. He stared at her for a long time before proposing a frightening pact. If she wanted Chidike to build her the city and empire of her dreams, she had to perform a ritual. She had two options: sleep with a man chosen by the mirror, or walk naked for 7 days in a cemetery. Amaka, terrified by the idea of walking through a graveyard, turned to the mirror. But what she saw there froze her. The reflection in the mirror revealed a familiar face, that of the madman who spends his time wandering the neighborhood. The same madman who wandered aimlessly through the streets, mumbling incomprehensible things. Amaka felt repulsed by the idea of sleeping with him, but the desire to possess this city was stronger than her dignity. She accepted the ordeal with icy determination, convinced that once she'd done it, everything would be better. Amaka, with a mixture of shame and resignation, began to seduce the madman. Every day she brought him food, approaching him slowly, until he trusted her. On the first night, she managed to lure him into a secluded corner, and despite the disgust that overwhelmed her, she performed the deed. She returned home, trembling, but convinced that the sacrifice had been worth it. The following nights passed in much the same way. Amaka convinced herself that each night brought her closer to her goal. The deeper she sank into the abyss, the more she convinced herself that she was in control of her destiny. But in reality, she was already trapped in a spiral of despair. The madman, for his part, understood nothing of what was happening, but continued to receive his offerings without question. The fourth night arrived. Amaka prepared for this final act with a newfound confidence. After this night, her husband would build the cities, and the whole neighborhood would admire him. She waited until nightfall to join her lover, but this time the madman was not in his usual place. Amaka frantically searched for him, aware that time was against her. Heart pounding, Amaka raced through the streets of her neighborhood in search of the madman. Every passing second brought her closer to the point of no return. If she didn't find him before midnight, the pact would be cancelled, and she'd have to start all over again. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The ordinarily peaceful neighborhood suddenly seemed hostile, every shadow an obstacle to her success. As the clock approached midnight, Amaka felt panic sweep over her. She had to find the madman, whatever the cost. But as the minutes ticked away, her hope faded. The reality of her failure hit her hard. She had sacrificed her honor, her dignity, for an impossible dream. And now she risked losing it all. Amaka, in despair, continued to search the neighborhood and neighboring districts for the madman. Every dark corner became a possibility. Every noise startled her. But the madman was nowhere to be found. She asked a few passers-by if they had seen him, but no one seemed to know where he was. As the clock ticked dangerously close to midnight, a strange presentiment took hold of her. It was impossible for him to have disappeared without a trace. What if someone had taken him away on purpose? Maybe the spirits were playing with her. Suddenly she caught sight of a shadow creeping up an alleyway, a figure that resembled the madman. Her heart leapt in her chest as she rushed towards him. It had to be him. Time was running out, and she had to accomplish her deed before midnight struck. But as she approached the shadow, she realized with horror that it wasn't the madman. It was a local boy, just passing through. Amaka's despair intensified, every second weighing like a hammer blow on her mind. The midnight chime echoed throughout the residential district. Amaka collapsed to the ground, feeling the weight of failure crush her soul. The pact was broken. She knew what that meant. The marabout had been clear. If she didn't respect the terms, the spell would be cancelled, and she would have to suffer far more serious consequences. Trembling with fear, she realized that she would never again be able to escape this curse. The price of her greed was about to manifest itself in the most terrifying way. Distraught, Amaka decided to return to the charlatan. She hoped he would give her a second chance, or at least offer her another alternative. As she crossed the dark paths leading to the old man's hut, she felt an icy chill run down her spine. When she arrived, the charlatan was waiting for her, as if he knew she'd come. His face was impassive, but his eyes shone with a malevolent gleam. "You failed," he said hoarsely. "Now you'll have to pay the price." Amaka fell to her knees, begging the marabout for one last chance. The old man, unmoved by her pleas, stared at her coldly. "There is no third choice," he said calmly. "You've broken the pact. From now on, it's up to your soul to pay." Amaka felt her heart clench. She realized too late that her greed had led her straight to her own destruction. The marabout gave her a final ultimatum. To escape the curse, she would have to perform the ultimate act of sacrifice, the life of her own child. Amaka stepped back, horrified by the very idea of sacrificing her daughter, Chidimma. How could she contemplate such a thing? Her flesh and blood, the child she loved more than anything else in the world. But the idea of losing everything she had, everything she had fought for, blinded her. Torn between her desire for the cities and her love for her daughter, she remained silent, unable to make a decision. Every fibre of her being struggled against the idea, but she knew time was running out. The marabout watched her, impassive. In the midst of this dilemma, a realization struck Amaka like a thunderclap. She realized that her obsession with material wealth had pushed her to a point of no return. She had sacrificed her dignity, her marriage, and now she was about to sacrifice her own child. A flash of lucidity crossed her mind. How could it have come to this? The image of Chidimma, innocent and full of life, appeared before her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt her heart clench with remorse. Amaka stood up, refusing to accept this ultimate sacrifice. Amaka turned on her heels and left without a word. She knew that by leaving the marabout's hut, she was leaving behind any chance of obtaining the cities of her dreams. But for the first time, it no longer mattered. What she had almost lost was far more precious than any wealth. When she returned home, she found Chidimma asleep beside their daughter. She gently approached, caressed her husband's face, and watched little Chidimma, a peaceful smile on her sleeping face. Amaka felt a heavy wave of guilt wash over her. The next morning, the events of the previous night haunted her. Chidimma noticed her strange behavior, but Amaka didn't have the strength to tell her the truth. The spells she had used against him had worn off, and she knew that sooner or later he would find out. Her behavior had brought him to the brink of ruin, financially and emotionally. Amaka knew that the charlatans would never forgive her for breaking the pact. She now lived in constant fear of their revenge. One evening, unable to bear the guilt that was eating away at her, Amaka confessed to Chidimma. She told him everything: the bewitchments, the charlatans, and the sacrifices she had almost made to obtain more wealth. Chidike, shocked and devastated, remained silent for long minutes. His eyes, once filled with love, were now tinged with sadness and betrayal. He couldn't understand how the woman he loved could have sunk so low. But instead of screaming, he got up slowly and left the room, leaving Amaka alone with her remorse. In the weeks that followed, Amaka's life became a living hell. The charlatans, furious that she had broken their pact, sent curses down upon her. Every night, she had terrifying nightmares, seeing shadows attacking her and reminding her of her sins. Her days were haunted by strange incidents. Objects fell mysteriously. Voices whispered in her ears. She felt the presence of evil all around her, constantly stalking her. Amaka realized that her own hell was not a place, but a state of mind. She would live with this terror for the rest of her life. After Amaka's heartbreaking confession, the days were dark and silent in their home. Chidike, though he had not left his wife, lived in deep bitterness. Amaka, for her part, was drowning in remorse. She felt trapped by the consequences of her own actions. One morning, driven by a need for relief, she decided to go to church, where as a child she'd always found solace. Sitting alone in the wooden pews, she wept for a long time, asking God to forgive her. That day marked the beginning of her return to the faith. Visits to the church became routine for Amaka. Every day she got up early and spent hours in prayer, asking God to heal her heart and restore her marriage. She avoided Adana, cutting all ties with her former associates. The church priest, a wise and gentle old man, noticed her assiduity. One day after Mass, he approached her and said gently, "My daughter, God doesn't reject anyone. No matter how great your faults, he will always open his arms to you if you turn to him with sincerity." These words resonated within her like balm on an open wound. As she continued on her way to church, a subtle change took place in the house. Chidike, observing Amaka's efforts, began to feel a slight transformation in his heart. He noticed that she had stopped asking him for material things and seemed calmer, more at peace. One evening, after a day's work, he found her in the living room, praying with their daughter Kioma by her side. The scene struck a chord with him. He remembered the early days of their love, when they were young and carefree, before greed corrupted their relationship. Amaka didn't let up. She immersed herself in prayer, fasting regularly and asking God not only to restore her marriage, but also to purify her soul. Chidike, though distant, was attracted by this new version of his wife. One Sunday morning, he decided to accompany her to church. It was a defining moment for both of them. Together, they prayed, hand in hand, for the first time in a long time. After Mass, Amaka turned to him, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." This simple gesture marked the beginning of a new era in their relationship. However, all was not yet won. Amaka knew that for their marriage to be truly restored, Chidike had to forgive her. But forgiveness is not an easy process. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Chidike broke the silence that had weighed on their relationship for months. "I want to forgive you, Amaka, but I don't know how," he said, his voice full of emotion. Amaka, recognizing the pain she had caused him, replied softly, "I may not deserve your forgiveness, but I love you, and I'll do anything to regain your trust." It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a first step towards healing. During this period of redemption, Amaka had a powerful dream. She was standing before a golden door, behind which was a brilliant light. A gentle, kind voice, which she recognized as that of God, said to her, "My daughter, you are forgiven. Now, learn to forgive yourself." Amaka woke up in tears, feeling a deep sense of peace for the first time in a long time. She understood that if God, in his infinite mercy, had forgiven her, it was time for her to free herself from her burden of guilt. Gradually, the tension in their home eased. Chidike, touched by Amaka's transformation, began to see in her the woman he had fallen in love with. They began spending time together again, discussing their plans and dreams. Amaka, for her part, was determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. She looked for ways to contribute to their home, no longer with material demands, but with her love, support, and renewed faith. Their once broken marriage was slowly being rebuilt on a firmer foundation, forged by faith and forgiveness. One day when they were both in church, the priest spoke of the power of faith and divine mercy. He quoted, "Those who walk in God's light are never forsaken, even in their darkest moments." These words resonated in the hearts of Amaka and Chidike. That day they made a decision. They would rebuild their lives together, no longer on material foundations, but on faith, family, and love. They prayed together, thanking God for the second chance he had given them. Amaka and Chidike, stronger than ever, decided to definitively turn the page on their past. They renewed their vows privately, in their home, with Kioma by their side. This symbolic gesture marked the beginning of a new era for them. They were aware that the path would not be without challenges, but they were now armed with unwavering faith and a love purified by forgiveness and redemption. Their home, once a place of conflict and misunderstanding, became a sanctuary of peace and harmony. Amaka, once consumed by greed and destructive ambition, found redemption in faith. This journey to God was not easy, but it was necessary to restore her marriage, and above all, her own heart. Thanks to divine grace, she learned the true value of things, not in material possessions, but in love, forgiveness, and faith. Chidike, despite the pain he had gone through, also found the strength to forgive, allowing their love to be reborn stronger and purer. This story, though rooted in deep human errors, reminds us that redemption is always possible, no matter how low we may fall. God, in his infinite mercy, is always ready to welcome us into his arms, if only we have the courage to return to him. Amaka and Chidike became for all to see a living example of what faith, forgiveness, and unconditional love can achieve.